I just cannot give you 100% of an answer right now.
You don't say that right now.
I believe now that you have something inside of you that's manipulative. It needs to stop. I'm not having the conversation anymore.
Don't talk to me with that attitude like that.
Edward finally got the answer he had been pushing Marissa to give him, and somehow the answer was even worse than the uncertainty. If Marissa had to decide right now whether she wanted to marry him, her answer would be no. Not maybe. Not I'm scared, but I'm still committed. No. And when you consider that Edward moved from the Dominican Republic into Marissa's life, her home, her social circle, her family expectations, and this entire 90-day pressure cooker believing they were building toward marriage, that answer hits very differently. But I actually think focusing only on the word no misses the biggest problem between these two. Because this relationship has slowly turned into a battle over who Edward is supposed to become. Marissa says she wants him confident. She wants him independent. She wants him to build his own life in America. She wants him to fit into her world more comfortably. But every time Edward starts pushing back, questioning her, demanding clarity, or refusing to just absorb another criticism, the dynamic changes. Suddenly, the man she wants to become more independent is being told that his behavior is the problem. And Edward is not completely innocent here either. Trying to bluff Marissa into admitting that she spoke with her ex was a terrible way to handle insecurity. If you feel like you have to trick your fiancé just to find out whether she is telling you the truth, you no longer have a simple communication problem. You have a trust system that is breaking down. And that is why I think this episode exposed something much bigger than wetting cold feet. Edward wants connection. Marissa wants distance. Edward wants reassurance. Marissa wants independence. Edward keeps saying, "We love each other." Marissa seems to be asking, but is love actually enough? And the real question now is not whether these two can survive another argument. It is whether Marissa wants Edward to become her equal, or whether she wants him to become somebody who fits more comfortably into the life she already had before he arrived. Because those are two very different things. The most revealing part of this whole situation is how differently Marissa and Edward seem to understand what is happening between them. Edward is looking at the relationship historically. He is basically saying, we have been together for years. We loved each other before this. We had good times. We made plans. I moved here. And now we have hit a rough period. So from his perspective, the solution is to work harder and get back to what they had. Marissa seems to be looking at the relationship almost like a compatibility test that has suddenly produced results she doesn't like. And to be fair to her, that is not completely irrational. Dating someone in another country is not the same thing as living together every day. Vacation romance is not the same thing as marriage. Seeing somebody when you are relaxed, excited, traveling, and separated from normal responsibilities is very different from sharing a home, dealing with family, handling money, navigating social expectations, and waking up next to the same person when both of you are stressed. That realization happens to a lot of couples. But there is a problem. Marissa is asking some of the most important compatibility questions after Edward has already crossed an international border and attached his immediate future to this relationship. That changes everything. If Marissa had been sitting in Pennsylvania 2 years ago asking herself, can Edward function in my social circle? Will he be comfortable around my friends? Will our education levels or lifestyles cause conflict? Will I feel intellectually connected to him? Will he be independent enough for me? Those would all be responsible questions. But once Edward is already there, those same questions feel less like screening for compatibility and more like performance evaluations. And that is exactly why so many viewers seem uncomfortable watching the way Marissa interacts with him. Because look at the imbalance. Marissa has her home. She has her career. She has her children. She has her friends. She has her family. She understands the culture. She knows how everything works. She knows where she belongs. Edward arrives in a country where nearly every part of his normal identity has been disrupted. His routines change. His support system changes. His social environment changes. His professional situation changes. His relationship with Marissa changes because now he is no longer the boyfriend she visits or vacations with. He is the person living inside her established world. So when Marissa says she needs him to become more independent, there is a reasonable version of that request, and there is an unreasonable version. The reasonable version is, Edward, I love you, but eventually I need you to build friendships, hobbies, confidence, and a life that is not completely dependent on me. That makes total sense. Nobody wants to be their partner's entire emotional, social, and practical support system forever. But the unreasonable version is, you have been here for a relatively short period of time, and I'm already frustrated that you have not figured out how to function like somebody who has lived here for years. That is not independence. That is instant assimilation. And those are not the same thing. This is where I think Marissa has one of her biggest contradictions. She says she wants Edward to be more independent, but independence requires somebody to develop confidence in their own choices. It requires them to create their own relationships. It requires them to have their own opinions. It requires them to say no sometimes. It requires them to disagree with you. You cannot ask someone to become independent and then become irritated every time that independence takes a form you do not personally approve of. And we are starting to see Edward test that boundary. For a long time, Edward has been the optimistic one. He has been the person saying, "We love each other. We can fix this. We can make it work." And I understand why that positivity frustrates Marissa, because optimism can become denial. If your partner says, "I am seriously questioning whether we should get married," and your answer is essentially, "But we love each other, so everything will be okay," you may not be hearing the seriousness of what the other person is telling you. Marissa is not wrong to say love by itself cannot sustain a marriage. She is absolutely right about that. You need respect. You need trust. You need compatible expectations. You need communication. You need financial understanding. You need some agreement about family. You need to understand how you resolve conflict. Love does not magically erase those things. But here is where I think Edward's frustration becomes understandable. He is not just asking Marissa to pretend everything is perfect. He is asking her to tell him whether she still wants the relationship. There is a difference. And imagine what that uncertainty feels like from Edward's side. You have changed countries for somebody. You are already being evaluated by their friends. You have dealt with suspicion from members of their family. You have been questioned about your intentions. Your partner is increasingly distant. Physical affection has decreased. You feel like she speaks to you in a way that makes you smaller. And now she cannot even tell you whether she wants to marry you. Of course, Edward is asking for reassurance. The issue is that he keeps asking Marissa for something she may not be emotionally capable of giving him right now. And every time he asks again, she appears to feel more pressure. This is where the relationship starts falling into that classic pursue and withdraw cycle. Edward senses Marissa pulling away. So Edward moves closer. He asks questions. He wants reassurance. He wants affection. He wants a hug. He wants certainty. Marissa experiences that as pressure. So Marissa pulls back even more. Edward feels the distance increasing. So his anxiety increases. Then he asks for even more reassurance. Marissa feels even more crowded. Then she distances herself again. And now suddenly both people believe the other one is causing the problem. Edward thinks, if Marissa would just show me love, I wouldn't feel so insecure. Marissa thinks, if Edward would stop being so insecure, I might feel more attracted and connected to him. That cycle can destroy relationships because both people are waiting for the other person to change first. And neither person realizes that their own reaction is feeding the exact behavior they hate in their partner. That brings us to the X situation. And I want to be careful here because this is where commentary can very easily turn speculation into fact. What we know from the storyline is that Marissa had communication with an ex. What we do not know from that alone is that she cheated. We do not know that the conversation was romantic. We do not know that she was secretly planning to leave Edward for this person. We do not know that Edward uncovered some affair. So, I would not jump from she spoke to an ex to she was caught cheating, because the evidence does not support that conclusion. But even without cheating, the situation is still important. Because Edward apparently believed that the best way to get honesty was to bluff. He created the impression that he knew something so Marissa would admit what had happened. That is not healthy. And I completely understand why Marissa called that manipulative. If your partner intentionally gives you false information because they want to trap you into a confession, that absolutely creates another trust issue. But this is also where I think Marissa makes the mistake of treating Edward's bad method like it exists in isolation. Why is Edward testing her? Why does he not trust a direct conversation? Why is this guy already searching for proof? That question matters. Because people usually do not wake up one morning in secure relationships and decide, you know what would be fun? I'm going to run a loyalty test on my fiancé. Testing behavior usually grows in environments where somebody already feels unsafe, suspicious, or chronically uncertain.
That does not justify it.
But it helps explain it. And right now, Edward has multiple reasons to feel uncertain. Marissa is questioning the marriage. She is less affectionate. He feels criticized. He feels judged. He knows she has contact with an ex. She is telling him she needs more time before deciding whether she wants to marry him. Put all of that together, and you can see how an insecure person starts thinking, maybe there is something I am not being told. Then he tries to catch her. Then Marissa sees the trap and thinks, see, this is exactly why I don't trust his behavior. Then she becomes more distant. Then Edward sees the distance and thinks, see, I knew something was wrong. And around they go. This is why I keep saying the ex is not actually the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that their relationship no longer has a reliable method for creating trust. Edward does not believe reassurance is enough. Marissa does not believe Edward's questions are coming from a healthy place. So, every conversation becomes an investigation. Every question feels like an accusation. Every boundary feels like rejection. Every attempt at reassurance feels temporary. That is exhausting. And then we get to the part of the episode that I think may reveal more about this relationship than all of their fighting combined. They sit down and make lists of what they need from each other. And Edward says he wants affection. He does not want to constantly ask for a hug. He does not want to constantly ask for a kiss. He wants Marissa to want to give him those things. That is important, because Edward is not really asking for physical affection. He is asking for proof that the relationship is still emotionally alive. A hug is not just a hug when you think your fiancé may not want to marry you. A kiss is not just a kiss when you already feel rejected. To Edward, affection has become evidence. He wants Marissa to touch him without being prompted because that would reassure him that she still wants him. Marissa's requests are completely different. She wants him less jealous. She wants him more independent. Notice the emotional difference. Edward's list is about connection. Marissa's list is about space. Edward is saying, come closer. Marissa is saying, stand on your own. And neither request is automatically wrong. That is what makes this complicated. The problem is that they are asking for opposite remedies at the same time. Edward believes closeness will make him more secure. Marissa appears to believe distance will make the relationship healthier. So, whose need gets met first? If Marissa gives Edward more affection, maybe his insecurity decreases and he becomes less clingy. But if she is already emotionally checked out, forcing affection could make her feel resentful and fake. If Edward becomes more independent, maybe Marissa feels less pressure and attraction returns. But if Edward interprets her demand for independence as another form of rejection, his insecurity may become worse before it gets better. That is why this cannot be solved with a list on a piece of paper. The list is useful. It gives them language. But language only works when the deeper problem is still reparable. And I think the deeper problem here may be respect. We hear people talk about love constantly on shows like 90 Day Fiancé. I love him. I love her. We love each other. Okay, but do you respect each other? Do you admire each other? Do you enjoy how the other person thinks? Do you feel proud introducing them to your world? Do you believe they are capable? Do you trust their judgment? Because you can absolutely love somebody and still discover that you do not respect them enough to build a healthy marriage. And when I watch Marissa and Edward, that is the question I keep coming back to. Does Marissa respect Edward? Not does she care about him. Not did she love him in the Dominican Republic. Not did they have great chemistry before. Does she currently respect him as a future husband and equal partner? Because some of her concerns seem to go beyond temporary frustration. She has worried about how he fits with her friends. She seems very focused on whether he can integrate into her environment. There have been questions around intellectual compatibility and lifestyle differences. She wants more independence. She becomes frustrated with his optimism. She appears irritated by some of the ways he communicates. Those are not small logistical complaints anymore. Those are signs that a person may be looking at their partner and wondering, are we actually equals in the way I need us to be? And if that is what Marissa is feeling, she needs to be honest about it. Because the cruelest thing she could do is keep Edward around for 2 weeks, then another 2 weeks, then another month, while secretly hoping he transforms into a person she respects more. That is not working on a relationship. That is putting somebody through an audition. At the same time, Edward cannot keep answering every compatibility concern with love. Love matters. Of course it matters. But if Marissa genuinely feels they are mismatched in major areas, Edward saying we love each other does not resolve that. He needs to ask harder questions too. Does Marissa make him feel valued? Does he like who he is becoming in this relationship? Is he becoming more confident or more anxious? Does he feel like a partner or like somebody constantly trying to pass Marissa's test? Would he still want this marriage if the visa process and years of emotional investment were removed from the equation? That last question is important, because sometimes people do not fight for relationships because the relationship is healthy. They fight because they have already invested so much. 2 years. A move. Family introductions.
Plans.
Paperwork. Promises. Public embarrassment. Fear of starting over. Those things create enormous pressure to keep going. And Edward may genuinely love Marissa while also being terrified of what it would mean if all of this ended now. That is where I do have sympathy for Marissa too. She has already been through a divorce. She has talked about once believing she would not marry again. She has children. She has an established life. So from her perspective, maybe the pressure is not simply, do I love Edward? Maybe it is, am I about to make another life-changing commitment that I will regret? And honestly, that fear is legitimate. If somebody has been divorced before, especially when children and complicated family dynamics are involved, they may approach remarriage with a level of caution that looks cold to somebody who has not lived through the same experience. Marissa may be realizing that being in love with Edward was easier when marriage remained theoretical. Now, the wedding has a date. Now the decision has consequences. Now she has to imagine him in her life not for another vacation, not for another year, but permanently. And perhaps that is why the doubts are becoming louder. So, I do not think Marissa is wrong for having doubts. I think she may be wrong in how she communicates those doubts and how little responsibility she sometimes appears to take for the emotional environment Edward is responding to. That is an important distinction. Marissa may be completely correct that they are incompatible, and she may still be treating Edward unfairly. Both things can be true. That is what gets lost when people turn reality TV into teams. Team Edward. Team Marissa. Who is the villain? Who is the victim? Real relationships are usually messier than that. Edward can be sympathetic and still behave badly. Marissa can have legitimate concerns and still speak to him in damaging ways. Edward's bluff can be manipulative. Marissa's emotional withdrawal can still be feeding his insecurity. Edward can need independence. Marissa can be expecting too much too quickly. Two people can both contribute to a toxic cycle without contributing equally in every moment. And that is pretty much what the fan reaction reflects. A lot of viewers are strongly siding with Edward right now. Many viewers are saying Marissa talks down to him. Some fans feel she treats him like somebody she is managing rather than somebody she is building a life with. A section of the audience believes she expects Edward to adjust to America, her friends, her standards, and her lifestyle far too quickly. And that independence conversation really hit a nerve. One Reddit discussion about Marissa telling Edward to become more independent attracted thousands of upvotes, which tells you this is not some tiny complaint a few people noticed. A lot of viewers heard that request and immediately thought, independent how? He just moved here. And I understand that reaction, because sometimes people who are fully established forget how much invisible knowledge goes into basic independence. Knowing where to go, knowing how systems work, having transportation, understanding social norms, having legal work authorization, knowing people, building professional connections, having money that feels like your own, feeling comfortable speaking in every environment, even knowing where you would go if you simply wanted to get out of the house and clear your head. Marissa already has all of that. Edward is building it. So when she evaluates him based on how independently he functions inside her world, she may be comparing his first chapter to her 15th. That is not a fair comparison. But there is another side to the fan discussion. Not everybody completely trusts Edward either. Some viewers are asking whether he is being given too much of a pass because Marissa is so unpopular. There has been fan speculation about parts of Edward's prior relationship or immigration history and whether audiences know the full story. Those are fan theories, not established facts, so I would not repeat them as truth. But I do think the skepticism serves a useful purpose. It reminds us not to turn Edward into a saint simply because Marissa is difficult to watch. The phone bluff matters. The pressure for an immediate yes or no answer matters. His jealousy matters. If Edward starts using Marissa's coldness as justification for controlling behavior, then this relationship gets even more dangerous. Feeling insecure does not give you permission to interrogate your partner. Feeling rejected does not give you permission to invade privacy. Feeling suspicious does not mean every suspicion is correct. That is the line Edward has to watch. And if I were advising either of them, I would say the same thing. Stop trying to win the argument and figure out what the argument is actually about. Because they keep arguing about incidents. A hug, an ex, friends, independence,
Torne.
walking away, a phone call. But underneath all of those incidents is one central disagreement. Edward believes the relationship is fundamentally good and currently struggling. Marissa seems increasingly worried that the relationship is fundamentally incompatible and that the good times were easier because they did not reflect normal life. Those are completely different diagnoses. And if you disagree on the diagnosis, you are going to disagree on the treatment. Edward wants repair. Marissa appears to want evaluation. Edward wants reassurance. Marissa wants evidence. Edward wants her to remember who they were. Marissa is focused on who they are now. And honestly, Marissa may have a point about one thing. Who they are now matters more. You do not marry the memory of a relationship. You marry the person standing in front of you. But Edward also has a point. You cannot invite someone to build a future with you and then treat every difficult adjustment like proof that the entire relationship was a mistake. There has to be patience. Especially when one partner sacrificed far more stability to enter the relationship's next phase. This is also why I think the 2-week deadline is almost meaningless. They keep treating 2 weeks like it is enough time to determine whether the relationship can be saved. But what exactly is supposed to happen in 2 weeks? Is Edward going to build an independent American social network in 2 weeks? Is Marissa going to suddenly become naturally affectionate again in 2 weeks? Is the trust problem around the ex going to disappear? Is Edward going to stop feeling jealous? Is Marissa going to stop questioning compatibility? Are her friends suddenly going to connect with him better? Are years of cultural difference going to resolve themselves?
No.
2 weeks might tell them whether they are willing to try. It cannot tell them whether the underlying structure works. And this is where their later episodes become important. We already know the conflict does not simply disappear after this conversation. The storyline continues getting worse. Their date night does not magically reset them. The tension continues. And that tells me episode 13 was not the crisis. Episode 13 was the pattern becoming visible. That distinction matters. A crisis is something unusual. A pattern is something repeatable. And what we are seeing is repeatable. Marissa withdraws. Edward pushes. Marissa criticizes. Edward becomes insecure. Edward pushes harder. Marissa retreats further. Then somebody says something extreme. They briefly reconnect. Then the same issue comes back wearing a different outfit. That is the danger. Couples can survive fights. They can survive really ugly fights. What they struggle to survive is the same emotional injury being recreated over and over again. And I think affection is a perfect example. Edward keeps saying he wants hugs and kisses. I do not think the real issue is that Marissa forgot to hug him enough. I think Edward is noticing that her body is expressing what she has not fully decided how to say. She is pulling away. Physical affection often changes when emotional certainty changes. So Edward may be treating lack of affection like a problem he can solve by asking for more affection. But if Marissa is withholding affection because attraction, trust, or emotional safety has changed, then asking her to hug him more does not fix the source. It just makes the symptom more visible. The same is true of independence. Marissa may think Edward becoming independent will solve her frustration. Maybe it will help. But if her real problem is that she no longer sees him as compatible with the world she wants, then Edward getting a hobby and making 3 friends will not fix that either. You cannot solve a respect problem with a social calendar. And that is why I keep coming back to the possibility that both of them are negotiating symptoms instead of confronting the real question. Do they actually like the person the other one is right now? Not the person from vacation. Not the person they hope will appear 6 months from now. The person right now. Does Marissa like Edward as he currently exists? Does Edward like the way Marissa currently treats him? Because love can keep people attached long after compatibility has started falling apart. And there is another uncomfortable possibility here. Marissa may genuinely love Edward and still unconsciously view herself as the person with better judgment, better social instincts, better knowledge of how life should work, and better awareness of what he needs to improve. That creates a parent-child dynamic very quickly. One person becomes evaluator. The other becomes applicant. One person points out what needs fixing. The other tries to prove they are good enough. Then attraction suffers because equality disappears. And once that happens, every disagreement becomes loaded. If Edward pushes back, Marissa experiences it as attitude. If Marissa corrects him, Edward experiences it as disrespect. If he needs reassurance, she sees dependence. If she needs space, he sees rejection. That is not a sustainable way to build a marriage. And yet, I also understand why Marissa may be struggling to let go. Because if she walks away now, she has to admit that the relationship that worked beautifully in one context did not survive another context. That is painful. It means love did not automatically translate into partnership. It means all the plans were not enough. It means bringing Edward to America did not confirm the relationship. It tested it. And maybe that is what the K1 process does better than anything else on this show. It compresses problems. Normally, couples can avoid big compatibility questions for years. But when you have a limited period to marry, everything becomes urgent. Family acceptance, money,
Work, sex,
trust, jealousy, where you live, who sacrifices what, how much independence each person needs, whether you actually like each other when life is boring. Everything gets dragged into the light. Edward wants Marissa to give him certainty before she has certainty. Marissa wants Edward to demonstrate independence before he has had time to build it. They are both asking the other person to provide something that may not realistically exist yet. And that is why their fights feel impossible to solve. If I had to predict where this emotional pattern goes, I do not think the affection issue disappears first. In fact, I think it probably gets worse whenever Marissa becomes more doubtful. The less certain she feels, the less naturally affectionate she is likely to become. The less affectionate she becomes, the more rejected Edward is likely to feel. Then jealousy increases. Then Edward starts asking more questions. Then Marissa feels watched and pressured. Then she wants even more space. That is the cycle. I also think Edward is going to become less agreeable.
We are already seeing it.
For a long time he absorbed criticism and tried to stay positive. But there is a limit to how long somebody can be evaluated before they start evaluating you back. And once Edward starts asking, "What are you doing for me? How are you treating me? Why am I always the one being told to improve?" Marissa may not like that version of independence nearly as much as she imagined. Because real independence is not just Edward making friends. It is Edward becoming confident enough to say, I do not accept this. And that could completely change the power balance. At the same time, Edward has to be careful. Standing up for yourself is healthy. Trying to control the person you are afraid of losing is not. There is a very thin line between asking for clarity and demanding reassurance. There is a thin line between noticing suspicious behavior and becoming invasive. There is a thin line between refusing disrespect and escalating every conflict. If Edward crosses those lines, the audience may start seeing him very differently. And maybe that is where the storyline is ultimately heading. Not toward one person being exposed as the villain, toward both of them becoming worse versions of themselves because the relationship keeps activating their biggest fears. Edward's fear appears to be abandonment. Marissa's fear may be losing autonomy and making the wrong commitment. Edward responds to fear by moving closer. Marissa responds to fear by moving away. That is a brutal combination, because every person's coping mechanism becomes the other person's trigger. And that is why I think the wedding question is almost secondary now.
Yes.
Obviously, whether they marry matters. But the more important question is what kind of marriage they would have if nothing changes. Imagine this exact cycle after the wedding.
Edward gets a job.
He meets coworkers. He starts going out more. Maybe Marissa genuinely likes the independence. Or maybe suddenly she feels less in control and new trust problems appear. Imagine Marissa continuing contact with people from her past. Does Edward become more secure over time, or does he become more suspicious? Imagine Edward wants more affection and Marissa is exhausted from work. Does he experience that as rejection? Imagine her friends criticize him again. Does Marissa defend him or agree with them? Imagine a financial disagreement. Who has the power? Imagine Edward wants to make a major decision. Does Marissa trust his judgment? Those are marriage questions. And right now, the answers do not look very reassuring. So when Marissa says she would say no today, maybe viewers should not only be angry about it. Maybe we should ask whether no today is actually more responsible than yes under pressure. Because getting married to avoid hurting Edward would be a disaster. Getting married because the K1 clock is running would be a disaster. Getting married because they have already spent 2 years together would be a disaster. If Marissa genuinely does not believe in the marriage, she should not do it. Where I criticize her is not for doubting. It is for allowing Edward to remain in a position where he constantly feels like he has to earn his way back into being chosen. Nobody should have to audition for affection indefinitely. And where I criticize Edward is not for wanting reassurance. It is for allowing that need for reassurance to turn into testing behavior. You cannot manufacture security by catching your partner in something. Even if your suspicion turns out to be correct, the relationship does not suddenly become healthy because you proved you were right. Trust is not a courtroom. The goal is not to win the case. The goal is to create a relationship where neither person feels like they need evidence folders. And right now, Marissa and Edward are nowhere near that. That is why I think the strongest way to understand them is this. Edward believes love should be the foundation they rebuild from. Marissa increasingly seems to think love may be the only thing left. And if that is true, they are much closer to the end than Edward realizes, because he keeps pointing to love as the reason to stay. She may be looking at everything surrounding that love and asking whether staying makes sense. Maybe she is unfair in how she expresses it. Maybe she expects too much from him. Maybe she is trying to reshape him. Maybe Edward is becoming too suspicious. Maybe he is applying pressure that makes her retreat. But underneath all of those possibilities is the one question neither of them can avoid forever. Can Marissa accept Edward without redesigning him? And can Edward love Marissa without needing constant proof that she still chooses him? Because if the answer to either question is no, the wedding is not going to solve anything. A wedding would just put legal paperwork around the same emotional cycle. And I think that is why this storyline has generated such strong reactions from viewers. People are not just reacting to Marissa being cold or Edward being insecure. They are reacting to something a lot of people recognize from real relationships. That feeling of loving somebody while slowly realizing you may not work together. That feeling of being told to change until you start wondering whether your partner actually likes you. That feeling of needing reassurance so badly that you accidentally push the other person farther away. That feeling of trying to decide whether the relationship is going through a rough patch or whether the rough patch has finally revealed the truth. And that is where I think Marissa and Edward are now. Not deciding whether they can survive one bad week. deciding what this bad week means. Edward thinks it means they need to fight harder for the relationship. Marissa seems to wonder whether it means they should stop fighting for it at all. And unless those two interpretations finally meet somewhere in the middle, every conversation from here is going to feel like two people arguing in different languages. So now I want to know what you think. Do you believe Marissa genuinely wants Edward to become more independent, or do you think she is slowly realizing that the Edward she loved in the Dominican Republic does not fit the husband she imagined having in America? And on Edward's side, does his insecurity make sense considering how uncertain and emotionally distant Marissa has become? Or did the moment he tried to bluff her about the ex prove that he is starting to cross his own line? Because, to me, that is the real story here. Not who won the argument. Not who said the worst thing. Not even whether Marissa says yes or no. The real story is whether these two still see each other as partners, or whether one of them has become the evaluator and the other one has become the person desperately trying to pass the test. And if that is what their relationship has become, then the 2-week countdown is not really about saving the wedding. It is about finding out whether there is still an equal relationship left to save.